All right, so let's jump into this situation in Germany, the upcoming election, the German federal election in 2025. Big one, right? Especially for our listener today who's actually prepping for a major investment meeting and their focus is Germany. So we got to make sure they have all the insights right.
Definitely a big one. This is not just any election. It's the kind of election where the outcome will have effects across Europe and beyond.
Yeah, and I mean for someone who's looking at investments, their portfolio, this is crucial stuff.
Absolutely. You can think of Germany's political landscape right now like a
Right.
pot simmering on the stove, right?
Mm,
You've got all these familiar ingredients,
mm,
some new spices being thrown in,
right.
and a whole lot of heat. It's about to boil over. And the results of this election, well, they're going to impact the EU, global economies, even how the world tackles these huge issues like energy transition and the whole thing with Russia.
Yeah, the tension there is not going away anytime soon, right?
Exactly.
And on top of all of that, the clock is ticking. I mean, we're talking October 2025, which sounds far away, but when you think about it, if you're making investment decisions now,
That's right.
that's not that far away.
Things are happening now that will be impacted by this.
So it's not just about who becomes the chancellor, right? We need to understand the whole Bundestag.
Oh, absolutely. The entire
The
composition.
whole power structure. This election is really going to reshape things.
Yeah, and I think what makes this election particularly interesting is the backdrop. All of these challenges,
Yeah.
climate change, economic anxieties, the war in Ukraine, I mean, these are massive issues.
Yeah.
And Germany's choices, I mean, they're going to impact everyone, and it's really adding fuel to this fire.
Okay, so let's talk about the guy in charge right now, right? So Olaf Scholz
Right.
from the SPD, he's running for re-election. He's got the experience, but he's also facing some major challenges, right? Kind of reminds me of Biden over here in the US.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there.
So how might those challenges, I guess, you know, impact his economic policies, which are obviously going to be key for our listener?
Well, I think one of the biggest things to consider is that Schultz's coalition government,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not just him. He's got the SPD, the Greens, the FDP.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a bit of a rocky road for them.
Yeah, and they came together to create stability.
That was the idea, right?
Yeah.
Stability. But when you've got these very different parties with different priorities, well, disagreements are bound to happen.
Yeah, I mean, especially on things like climate and economic policies. I mean, those are big
It's
ones.
huge. And those disagreements, they create friction. Look at their debates about phasing out coal, for instance. Germany wants to hit those climate goals,
Right.
but that has a direct impact on industries,
Hmm.
on jobs, and ultimately voters' wallets.
So it's a tough balancing act.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how they handle it, well, it's going to send a strong signal about their overall economic approach, which of course is what our listener needs to pay attention to.
Okay, so you've got this rocky coalition, and you've also got, a pretty strong opposition. The CDU, led by Friedrich Merz, they're ahead in the polls.
Yeah, sitting pretty at around 30%.
I mean, they're kind of often compared to the Republicans over here in the
Mhm.
US, right? Emphasizing, economic stability, traditional values.
Yeah, that's a good starting point. But I think what's important for investors is to understand why that comparison matters.
Right.
A CDU-led government would likely be more, let's say, pro-business, which could mean things like tax cuts or deregulation.
So it could be good for some sectors, right?
Potentially. Manufacturing, finance, those could benefit. But there's always a flip side. It could come at the expense of social programs, environmental regulations. So for someone looking to invest in Germany, understanding those trade-offs is crucial.
It's a fascinating comeback story too, right? I mean, they lost in 2021.
Yeah.
So Merz is kind of rebuilding after Merkel. I mean, Merkel was incredibly dominant.
A long, long reign.
But we can't forget about the Greens either,
No, definitely not.
especially with all the young voters, right? I mean, they're holding steady at around 18%, but there's this tension, right, between their ideals, their environmental goals, and the potential impact on industry.
Yeah, and that internal struggle within the Green Party, it's something anyone looking at renewable energy in Germany needs to understand because they're committed to those environmental goals.
Right.
But how far are they willing to go if it means hurting powerful industries? Look at their stance on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example. That was a major dilemma for them. On one hand, you've got their environmental goals, and on the other, you've got realpolitik. That pragmatic approach where you prioritize national interests, even if it means compromising.
I think for our listener who may not be, deep into political jargon, can you just break down that word, realpolitik, and its implications a little bit?
Sure, realpolitik basically means making decisions based on practical considerations, right? Not just ideology. So for the Green Party, it means they might sometimes prioritize economic stability or energy security even over those ambitious environmental goals. And for investors, that translates into needing to analyze how the Greens are going to balance these competing priorities. Will they push for rapid decarbonization, even if it disrupts things? Or will they take a more gradual approach to protect those industries?
So it's not as simple as saying Green Party equals good for renewable energy.
Exactly. There are nuances there, potential roadblocks that investors need to be aware of.
Okay, so we've got the SPD, the CDU, the Greens, all kind of jostling for position. But there's another player here that we need to talk about, the AFD.
Right. They're consistently polling at around 15%.
And attracting voters who are dissatisfied with those mainstream parties.
It's something we've seen with populist movements globally, tapping into anxieties about things like immigration, the EU's influence, economic uncertainty.
And while their chances of, winning outright are slim, their presence could really impact how those coalitions are formed.
Oh, absolutely. It adds a whole other layer of complexity.
So what kind of impact could their rise have on, the economic and political landscape, particularly for someone looking to invest in Germany?
Well, if they gain enough influence to be part of a ruling coalition, their policies could impact everything, right? From trade to immigration. They're skeptical of the EU, which could affect Germany's economic integration. That creates uncertainty for foreign investors. Their stance on immigration could impact the labor market, specific industries.
Okay, so we've got the SPD, the CDU, the Greens, and now we've got the AFD adding another layer of uncertainty. We haven't even touched on the smaller parties, right? The FDP, the left.
Right.
It's a crowded field. So for our listener, how should they start thinking about these potential coalitions that could emerge? And, which ones would be good for them? Which ones maybe not so much?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where Germany's electoral system gets really interesting, because you often end up with coalitions, which means smaller parties can actually become kingmakers.
So they have more power than maybe their vote share would suggest.
Exactly. This election is less about one winner and more about who can actually forge those alliances to form a government. So let's dive into those potential coalition scenarios and how they might impact your investment strategy.
Okay, so you've got this complex web of parties, each with their own agenda, and the potential for some, surprising alliances.
It really is like a political puzzle, isn't it?
It is.
Where the pieces are constantly shifting.
But let's kind of shift our focus now to the big issues, the things that are really dominating this election.
Right.
How are these parties tackling these challenges, and what does it mean for our listener who's looking to make these smart investment decisions?
Okay, well, let's start with the big one. Climate change and energy policy. Germany's goal of carbon neutrality by 2045, that's a huge deal. It's driving these massive investments in renewable energy, but it's also causing a lot of anxiety about potential economic disruption.
Yeah, it's a real tightrope walk.
It is.
And for a listener, it means, carefully analyzing each party's approach.
Exactly.
Rapid change might mean short-term disruption, but a slower pace could mean missing out on opportunities in this, booming renewable energy sector.
It's all about timing and knowing where to place your bets.
Exactly.
And we need to connect this to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Germany is a major industrial powerhouse. So their energy choices have implications far beyond their borders.
Right.
Their transition will impact global supply chains, energy markets. It's going to create both risks and opportunities for investors worldwide.
So for someone putting money into Germany, understanding where each party stands on this is absolutely crucial.
It is.
And you mentioned the Green Party's internal struggles.
Right.
Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more? Like, what are their potential policies and how might those impact specific sectors?
So the Green Party, despite its name, it's not a monolithic entity, right? They have factions that prioritize different aspects of environmentalism.
Right.
And this internal debate, it's going to shape their policies.
Right.
A more radical green government might push for rapid decarbonization, heavily subsidizing renewables, phasing out fossil fuels aggressively.
So that would create huge opportunities in the renewable energy sector. But it could also disrupt industries reliant on fossil fuels.
Exactly.
Potentially impacting manufacturing energy prices.
That's right. It's not just about assuming that a green victory means a blanket win for renewable energy.
Right.
Investors need to dig deeper, understand the nuances of their approach.
So there are layers to this.
Absolutely.
Okay, so climate change energy policy, clearly critical for anyone investing in Germany. Let's move on to another major concern, economic stability.
Okay.
Inflation